Marvel's Avengers over the course of its 3-year life has been met mostly with negativity and ridicule, and I think a lot of that is warranted and very deserved. But with the recent announcement of the game shutting down in September, yeah, this video took a while to make. I'm sorry, it was supposed to come out in September, but I kind of fucked it a bit, and college kept my ass on a short film. It was a lot of shit, okay, I'm sorry. I decided to revisit the game to see all the new content that I'd missed and to give the online love a shot after all the various patches. Now, this video is about a lot of things with this game, you'd hope so in that runtime, but it's all about where this game is now at the end of its development. This is the game in its current state, the state that you would get it in if you bought it or pirated it or replayed it today, the game's final state. There were time codes for each section I discuss, and just as a note, if you struggle with my pronunciation or words or find my accent hard to grasp, don't worry, I do too sometimes. This absolutely insanely long video and all the videos thereafter this year are fully subtitled by my amazing friend Pim. They don't have any socials that I can plug, so in the description is going to be a link to their book. Just check it out for me, it might be your thing, it might not be, it's worth a shot. So without further ado, let's tackle Marvel's Avengers after its final update. Now, when it comes to Reassembled, I think one of the easiest things to point to as this campaign's biggest flaw is the fact that it's a video game. Now, I know that does sound insane, but I think that a big issue in this game's introduction, and how trying to get you to relate to Kamala as a lead character, is the fact that the game is really trying to keep players engaged. Okay, so here's a run through the start in case you forgot. We open on A-Day, the super commercialized celebration of the Avengers as these big in-universe celebrities. Kamala is there because of a contest that she's won that, combined with some stuff that we see later, really puts her in the position of a superfan. It's a direction that I think was really smart for the lead character. It's absolutely full-blown wish fulfillment to do this, and it's furthered by bumping into Thor and Cap and having Iron Man compliment your backpack, but I genuinely really like it for that. It makes Kamala quite endearing as a main character. I think the biggest reason people dislike this opening is mostly just because a lot of people like to rag on Marvel writing, which is a bit of a Twitter misnomer since the D&D movie that came out this year has a lot of the same writing conventions but was still well received. From a writing and direction standpoint, I think the opening is genuinely really solid. The San Francisco bridge attack is really fun, and while I'm mostly talking about combat in the gameplay section, I would just like to add that I think that the game uses quick time events pretty well. They don't feel super intrusive and almost always feel like they have a purpose of some sort. I like the Black Widow one in particular since it leaves this nice long shot, but after that the game skips 5 years, which personally I think was a bit too much. Now, while I did just say that, I am actually fine with the skip being 5 years, especially when we see how things have changed with Hank Pym and the expansion stories. But because of that time skip, we never see Kamala's early struggle with her powers, which loses some of that relatability. The Terrigen Mist being the cause of her powers is barely shown, like I'm pretty sure it happens here, but since we don't see her react to it, it could have happened off screen. I don't even think for the sake of the writing and the story we need to see at least a little bit of her learning how to use these powers. We just jump into her being pretty skilled with all of it. But you can't do that because that would grind the gameplay to a halt. Doing an extra tutorial segment with Kamala before the rest of the story stuff starts would really drag, and people already consider this game's opening to be way too long. So it's really difficult to say what the right approach would have been. Personally, I would have been fine with more cutscenes to get us to better relate to Kamala, but I'm not the general audience. And I really feel for the crew and the team behind the game because it's an impossible situation to get out of without getting a group of people angry. I do like what little we do get that implies what Kamala got up to at that time though. While we as players do just skip to when things get interesting, which again I'm not a huge fan of, but it's either that or a lot more cutscenes, so a lot of people wouldn't like that either, and I'm not going to mention this again in this video, it just annoys me a little bit, I'm sorry. Her little headquarters you see is really endearing, and while I know that a lot of people find the Marvel kind of dialogue where a character quips themselves a lot to be annoying, in this case I think it's used quite well to fit in the time that's passed, and Kamala as a character really fits the quipping in the face of insurmountable odds were in this game. It works as her being the light the Avengers need to come back together. We see the statues at Heroes Park defaced and ruined, which really nails home the void that the Avengers have left, with AIM literally trying to build over the park and make them forgotten. I also think the chase of Kamala is done well. It's as on the ground as the game gets, and I would have enjoyed more of it later on. We really see the presence that AIM has in the setting, but we kind of forget about that after this point, and none of the characters in the game are the same boots on the ground perspective. It's a real shame, and it's something that I think the game needed to keep its themes really strong. Sandra Hunt's performance as Kamala, however, is really great. She delivers some pretty rough lines with enough emotion and energy to make them work really well. And her performance makes the scenes of emotional weight have a bit more, even if those scenes unfortunately weren't built up to as much as they should have been. Her speech to the Avengers just before the last few missions that basically marks the end of the character arcs of the Reassembled campaign is a speech that's really good at capturing why these Avengers work. I'll be going more into all of that in the conclusion though. Anyway, when we get to the Chimera helicarrier, we're introduced to probably the best character in the game, Bruce. Now, I have my gripes with Hulk, and we'll talk about that when I talk about gameplay, but I adore Bruce. His dialogue is great, his performance by Troy Baker is phenomenal. Honestly, it's probably one of my favourite Troy Baker performances, which is really saying something. Bruce is so nervous and anxious and doubtful. He really keeps the story and the tone and the vibe that the game is going for. His scenes with Kamala single-handedly hold the game's story together for me. They are such a high point that sometimes you'd think the game was bordering on being a masterpiece. The scene between him and Tony at his old place is really brilliant, and the scene between him and Monica is great as well. It all makes it the absolute highlights of the Reassembled campaign. Unfortunately, it's not all good in the Reassembled campaign for Bruce though. The Hulk doesn't really do much in the story, it's much more about Bruce, which I'm not super against. But I definitely think it detracts from the overall story, especially since it means we see much less of what Bruce tells us about. I don't think showing him struggle more, if not struggle embracing the Hulk more, could have benefited the game's core themes even more. I'm fine with horror reviews that he does, in fact it makes it this really good conflict with Tony on the bridge. But neither him or Tony changed their minds by the end of the main campaign. And it's a real shame that made for a lot of missed potential. While I still want to sing the writer's praises for a bit here, it's clear that a lot of effort went into Banner and Commando in particular, and it shows. And I'd say that a similar amount of effort went into Tony as well. His arc in the game about needing to take responsibility of what other people do with what he makes is interesting and slightly underbaked. And Nolan North does a phenomenal job, even if he really is just doing his best RDJ impression. But when you're as good a voice actor as Nolan North, there's not really need to complain. The main idea of the story, at least to me, is that it's all about accepting differences. Kamala goes the whole game trying to be accepted, fighting against Tarleton and Abe who want her to believe that her difference is something wrong with her, something that needs to be fixed. Kamala then tries to be accepted as an Avenger, but when she finally finds them, she finds that the two most popular Avengers, the first two that she finds, can't even accept themselves as Avengers, yet alone Kamala. But it takes a lot of effort and struggle and a pretty good speech to make them finally accept themselves. And also the second chance there is seeing that Cap isn't dead. It's really solid and I like it, even if I wish more was done to fully utilise these themes, especially after Cap is brought back. I would have really liked to see where Tony has a come to God moment with one of the Avengers that you trust and just gets everything off of his chest. Just a few scenes like that would have seriously elevated this campaign to just pretty great to worth the price of admission alone. And I mean the AAA price tag admission, the half price tag that the game ended with. Another big theme is how we cope with our failure. We see all the ways the various Avengers have dealt with what happened at A-Day. Tony living off the grid trying to hide. Bruce letting his guilt consume him and staying in the Hulk for a whole year. But we also see the positive ones as well, like Hank Pym fighting against AIM. Same with Nat, and we also see how it affects Tarleton, who after turning into what he is, believes that he needs to take the most extreme methods to make sure that nothing like it can ever happen again. Because he doesn't trust power no matter how trustworthy the people who wield it are. As far as Black Widow 4 and Cap are concerned, a larger narrative, they don't really, at least character-wise in the Reassembled campaign, do a ton. I do like how the team dynamic changes to be so team-focused when Cap is back in the fold though, and I really like that was infiltrating AIM undercover. And I'm personally fine with keeping the larger cast a bit further back and keeping the emotional centre around Bruce and Kamala. It was a good call in my opinion. The Reassembled campaign does fumble a bit on its villains. I like MODOK in this game for the reasons I went to earlier, but he just doesn't have enough going on. He's not given enough scenes to really come into his own and get us to either empathise with or hate him. So you're left with a very lukewarm feeling on him. Monica is also a bit undercooked, but considering how much is set up for future expansions, I'm willing to at least slightly defend it. What we do get is some great groundwork that could have been built off of even more if the game was still getting expansions. As for the finale of Reassembled, I'm pretty mixed on it. I like that it starts with the Avengers not even being challenged, they're equipping constantly. I like the Tony Juice Clothes joke. I personally think it goes on a bit too long though, but it doesn't really matter, it's still good. I do really like that as soon as MODOK brings up the Kree Sentry, the tone completely shifts. Tony stops quipping entirely and you have to soak in this really dire tone. It's really great, and I like the quick time event finale with Kamala, even if it is pretty bland because it is just a quick time event finale. A pretty solid ending even if it did stumble a bit. So with the Reassembled story tackled, let's now talk about combat of our first 6 Avengers. The base combat system of every character is pretty much the same. You've got your light attack, heavy attack, and combos based around that. Every character also has an intrinsic meter, and depending on what character you are, it could do completely different stuff. As an example, with Kamala, the meter temporarily gives a damage buff and a cool visual effect. For Hulk, the meter heals you and gives you some extra damage. And for Iron Man, all of your range attacks drain the intrinsic meter, so for him the meter functions like ammo. You've also got some cool finisher moves you can use on enemies that are doing enough damage in a short period of time, which are visually cool if nothing else. But something I think the game is lacking is expansion on its base mechanics for all characters. The game does have a few additional mechanics like vaulting, but aside from extremely situational spots I can never find much use for them. Everything else interesting about the game's combat is dependent on your characters, which means that your mileage will vary greatly between them. If you always want to be stuck in the game's up close brawling, you'll have a fun time with the characters to benefit from range or even a mix of both. I know the game's gear system can negate some of that issue, but that doesn't really matter until the late game, so I'll be saving it until then. Something that I can talk about now is the enemy design, which over the course of Reassembled is pretty solid. It doesn't drag on, and there's some more interesting visual designs rather than just robots and mercenaries would have been nice, as well as maybe a few more boss battles throughout the game. But moving on, you can very easily split Reassembled's gameplay into two halves. There's the unique content that's specific to the campaign, and there's the establishing of the content that you'll be doing in the endgame. While the later section is really annoying on replay, I think it's harmless to first time players, since it means that when these mechanics like vaults and capture points and high value enemy objectives are used in the wider online and the post game, everyone's already on the same page. And the unique content is a huge range of actual quality, but overall I think it's pretty solid. Going from the start, I think that while the A-Day stuff is super annoying on replay, it's good to establish from a gameplay perspective this powerless kid, since it makes for such a huge contrast when you start playing as the Avengers. Speaking of, all of their game mechanics are tutorialized quite well in the San Francisco bridge encounter. There are a few nitpicks I could add, but overall it's great from a gameplay perspective at teaching you all the mechanics you'll be building on later. Then, when we unlock Kamala just afterwards, we get to finally dive into a specific character's gameplay. Kamala's prototype in the Hulk is the simplest character to play. As far as I can tell, Kamala doesn't have any kind of complicated mechanics. There's no multiple weapon types to keep track of, and she's perfect as an introduction to the game. Her animation work is nice, and I really like the gameplay. She has decent range when she needs it, but is mostly good at up close brawling. Her intrinsic meter gives her a damage boost that is satisfying to use, and she's fun to control, it's also for being a drag to play. That on top of her grapple arm thing makes her a fun character for the game to introduce movement to us. At first in a mostly harmless way we explore the rooftops, but later in this chase sequence that I think is really good. The game takes us further in the Camaro where you have the Hulk chase, and there's some simple harmless puzzle solving to break up all the action. There's also the stealth segment in the first section that isn't brilliant or anything, but it's not bad at all, and certainly not as bad as other 4 stealth segments in action games. And throughout all of that, of course, combat is being introduced to you, and the game honestly kind of tricks you into thinking that the game has better combat than it actually does, because the enemy structuring is so much better when Reassembled than anywhere else. Later on, the game just throws sinks at you, because it knows that no single enemy can pose much of a threat after around 3/4 of the way through Reassembled. But at the start, when a player is learning the ropes and doesn't have super powerful gear or was leveled up much, enemies could definitely pose a threat individually. The best example of this is the Adaptoids, the biggest single enemy in Reassembled, who when you first meet them, they're tough targets that you need to focus down. But after the campaign and a small bit of post game, they just become little road bumps. This ends up making Reassembled's combat for the first half of the story missions really fun, as the game feeds you new enemies and new combat encounters at a pretty satisfying rate. One that's always fun for me is when Kamala gets ambushed in this aim facility and you can swing between these two ledgers. Unfortunately though, the game only reaches its height of design once later in the game, and I'll talk about that when we get to it. Another thing I'd really like to rag on though are the game's difficulty options, which is just the same old simplistic, make you weaker, make enemies do more damage, make enemies hard to kill design of difficulty. There's no new mechanics or enemy design changes, and it just feels like shit playing on anything above normal. Enemies and especially bosses become extreme sponges, and when I was replaying the game for the 3rd time, I gave up on trying to beat it on hard and just beat it on normal. Even though I was winning and I was playing the game well enough, simple mistakes can just end fights entirely, and it just isn't the kind of combat system that can facilitate that kind of punishing gameplay. But going to a positive, I really like the game's 3 different super abilities. Your first power for most characters is support power, your second is offensive in some way, and your third is his ultimate ability. It's far from unique, but I think it's really necessary in a game where you need to feel like a superhero. Kamala's powers are really good at helping teach you this. The first support power is one of the better ones in the entire game, healing both you and nearby allies, which is great. The offensive ability, the high 5, helps with Kamala's weak range and is just really handy, pun intended. And then Bigger as her ultimate is both a visual spectacle and is just fun to use, and sets the standard well for a lot of ultimates in the game. Moving on to Hulk now, I really like him as well, even if he is also extremely simple. But honestly, if you ask me, that really works. He's the Hulk, he smashes shit, that's the whole deal. And the game definitely fulfills that power fantasy. You can pick up and throw enemies, the camera shakes with your movements, and your intrinsic ability just makes you harder to kill, which feels surprisingly great to use even if it's really simple. Unfortunately, even though his movement is great in the larger, more open maps, he's a fucking nightmare in close spaces, and he's the only character I'd say has bad movement because of how much of this game we'll be spending indoors. His support ability is more offensively to get damages and does a status effect to nearby enemies, which is cool even though it does feel a bit useless sometimes. His offensive ability does a lot more damage as the same effect, but has a cool unique interaction with mechs and some bosses, which is pretty sweet. And his ultimate ability is the Thunderclap, which does huge damage in front of him and feels great. But when talking about issues, I definitely think that Hulk doesn't deal enough damage relative to other characters regardless of what difficulty you're on. For a character whose whole deal is his insane strength and power, the time to kill for enemies feels like it takes forever. Hulk only does about the same amount of damage as any other character, and it just feels like shit. I also think that Hulk should be a bit tankier, but that's nowhere near as much of a problem as this damage issue. On top of that, the boss fight of Abomination, the same level you're introduced to Hulk, is just alright. It's just you wailing on him for about 5 minutes, but it's not offensively boring or bad on any difficulty below hard, and the dialogue is actually quite fun. Now skipping on a few missions to Iron Man, he's absolutely my favourite. He's the first flying character you get, and the way that all of his abilities are first tutorialised to you with Kamala in the harm room, and then drip fed to you in the Golden Arches fight is brilliant. His animations are my favourite in a game that overall just has some brilliant animation work. It is an absolute joy to play. The range to melee mix is a blast, and the intrinsic meter that incentivizes melee more is a really smart move to stop Iron Man from being a campio option. His multiple weapon types that you unlock before the end of the campaign are great as well, and a ton of great variety. He's tied with one other character that you don't get till late game for just the most fun to level up and progress with. While with Bruce and Kamala, I didn't really feel like I made tons of progress with new moves and stuff, since most of them were quite situational. But I always felt like each new level of the skill tree mattered with Iron Man, although he does still have a few extremely situational skills. Iron Man's support ability gives you max intrinsic energy for a bit, just spam as many range options as possible, and when you get into the further trees and the further options you get with this ability, it's probably the best one in the game. The Unibeam offensive ability is great, although just as a tip to any newbies who get the game after this video, make sure you hold down the button while you're using the Unibeam, so it makes it last twice as long, and the game never properly explains that. Thanks to the Marvel Avengers Discord for telling me about that one. And the Hulkbuster ultimate ability makes you feel way more like the Hulk than playing the Hulk does. But it is still an absolute blast to use. And it has this cool additional feature where you can place it on the ground for either your later use or any other character to hop in and use. And you gain all of their ability and gear stats as if you were their Iron Man, which is really cool. And I would just like to reiterate that at this point in the game, the enemy pacing is still pretty great. Combat is still challenging enough at this point with new enemy types you have to deal with differently really well, and the combat is still engaging and fun. And then we get to Black Widow, who is right up there with Iron Man as one of my favourites of the base Avengers. Widow also has a lot of range options, especially when you start upgrading her skill tree, but unlike Tony, who's incentivized to get in close because he needs it to generate intrinsic energy, Widow is incentivized to get in close because she performs much better in melee than at range. Her range weapons are really good, don't get me wrong, but thanks to her grapple counter that also works as a gap closer and the intrinsic ability that makes it so after a certain amount of hits and taking no damage you gain this huge damage boost until you get hit, you're really incentivized to get in close and pick your moments and exploit any weaknesses you can in a given fight. It's great. Her heroic abilities only further this. The support ability makes you and anyone near you invisible while being really situational. It can be really handy when used right. And the offensive ability does a fair bit of damage and stuns weaker enemies, is great for helping deal with tougher fights, all fights that have tons of enemies to deal with. But the ultimate really highlights just how great Widow is. The ultimate has all of your melee attacks at these wide, fast-hitting, big damage-dealing attacks that is on top of the damage boost to all of your other attacks. And when this move is used properly, it can feel like cheating. It's absolutely devastating. And Nat's movement is really fun too. It's not as far as leaping or flying across the map, but everyone loves a grappling hook. And the Adaptoid encounter with Monica boss fight after your introduction to that is really fun and shows how great this game can be when it really goes for it. This, followed by the Helicare set piece, is the absolute peak of the Reassembled campaign for just sheer gameplay. The mech encounter in the server room, clearing the deck, all the really good environments that sell the tone, it's really solid. The star boost and further space station sequence where you save Cap afterwards is also really good, and adding it all up is probably the best streak of missions in the entire game, flat out. And then we get both Thor and Cap at the same time, which are our last reassembled characters. I'll talk about Thor first. Thor is another pretty simple one. His attacks feel heavy and there's some fun tricks you can do with the hammer, like pinning enemies to walls. His intrinsic ability is almost the same as Hulk's because you armor the damage boost instead of health for the damage boost, but also with the added bonus that enemies pinned with a hammer get the occasional shock of damage. His support ability is probably my favourite in the game. It maxes out your intrinsic meter while giving yourself and every ally no matter where they are on the map an armor boost. While it sounds pretty simple, it's surprisingly clutch in some of the harder post-game fights. His offensive ability is this big blast of damage outwards and a wave in front of you, which is some big damage, and the ultimate is this big Bifrost AoE that you can put basically anywhere within reason without being interrupted or thrown off by any other enemies. Overall, a simple but great character, and combined with all of his cool flight stuff, an absolute blast to play. Cap is my third favourite in the game, but we'll get to the second favourite in a long while because this video is way too long. His movement revolves around this cool double jump and run ability, which is surprisingly fun and intuitive even if it does look a bit goofy. And his combat is the most fun for a melee based character in the entire game in my opinion. He's a blast of brawl with his countering intrinsic ability that also reflects lasers, is super fun to use. On top of this, his support super that increases damage to nearby enemies just makes time to kill even quicker. His offensive super can clear rooms, and his ultimate that changes his moveset to do even more damage makes Cap a super fun brawler that can just clear out enemies. I think with specific builds he might have the quickest time to kill of any character, but I didn't want to and didn't have time to or the grinding to test that. And now that we have all the Avengers, we can tackle the big final level, which is probably the only time the game makes enemy syncs work well. Taking on this many dreadbots and adaptoids is a really good way to feel how far you've come in skill and combat. It's pretty satisfying, and the switching of characters throughout is fun as well. The MODOK fight, while not being challenging or particularly brilliant, is still fun for the spectacle alone. I'll always be pumped during the final sequence of the Kree Century, but unfortunately the ending does ring pretty hollow from a gameplay perspective. And that's it for the gameplay for Reassembled. It's a pretty strong start and it laid a brilliant foundation, so let's go back to the story to see how the game's first expansion built on the game's campaign. Now I'm going to go on a slight tangent here. When you're making a live service game like this, like Destiny 2 or something like that, where you want your players doing mission after mission after mission for thousands of hours, you can't really lean too heavily on your voice cast. Unfortunately, this is the Avengers, a crew that needs to be talking all of the time because that's why we love them. This is something you see super clearly in the game's post-game missions, where it's just the same supporting cast of S.H.I.E.L.D. and the Human Alliance members talking to each other because they were as expensive as the main cast. And while I do understand that choice, it really takes away from my personal enjoyment in the game. So you win about the game's writing, it is a big draw for me. But I'm really not attached to Maria Hill without what I do in the history of Taskmaster. I do really like this game's Hank Pym as mad scientist finds it not too over the top. I love him, but he just can't carry all of this. And neither can this game's version of Jarvis, although he is great too. I bring this up even though we're not at the post-game because this is an issue that stems into both of the first additional campaigns. Bruce doesn't get a single line in taking his main campaign, and Thor only talks at the end. Cap gets 2 scenes I think, and Iron Man, Nat and Commander all do get a bit more than that, but it's really not much. In this campaign you do fucking time travel by the way, but the only people who talk about it are Kate and Hank Pym. It's a real shame. Commander, Cap and Tony especially I think have a lot of interesting stuff to say about this. And this is unfortunately an issue throughout these first 2 additional campaigns. I want to highlight it because it can be really fucking distracting. But more importantly, it makes the post-game so much less enjoyable, so you don't have that endearing banter the Avengers are known for anymore. It's a real shame, and it makes the one place this dialogue does happen, the elevator during loading, really stand out as a highlight, but also really highlight where everything is lacking. With that aside, I do enjoy taking aim. I think Kate is cool and different while still playing up the cast well, mostly due to Ashley Birch putting a brilliant performance that goes above and beyond the material. And I do like taking his plot stuff. I enjoy time travel, I like Clint, although I will say, just like Reassembled, it does need more. I'd love to have just a few more scenes between Kate and Kamala as the newest and youngest Avengers. I'd love to have someone other than Kate come out on the Super Adaptoid. This is the kind of thing that the Avengers would quip about constantly, but you get none of that in the fight. Clint also really suffers in this game. The story tries to address the consequences of what happened when the Avengers were gone, but it just kind of feels like an excuse as to why aside from one picture, Hawkeye wasn't even mentioned in the previous campaign. It's a weird thing this game has in general, like Captain Marvel exists in this world, Cap, Commander and Kate all comment on it. I know that she deals with a lot of off-planet stuff, but no one mentions her being able to actually turn up or not turn up or not. Like, she would be an insane help in this fight. Like, maybe you could say she got captured by AIM and the Avengers can't find her, or the government deemed her too dangerous so she had to flee off-world. But I couldn't even find a throwaway line of dialogue justifying it, which is again a shame. One thing I will credit the game for though is that it's really thought out with the story elements when it wants to be. So thought out that I'm gonna let the time travel thing slide. The game did come out really soon after Endgame, so I'm assuming that time travel was either a coincidence, poor communication, or a deliberate choice to tie to the MCU. Or coincidental thinking that the developers decided to stick with. This campaign has a chance to have maybe been in development before Endgame released, so all 3 are possible. The game does a good job keeping the story together if you're looking for it. If you play the side missions before playing Future Imperfect, you'll know that Black Widow encounters something called Element X while undercover. And that's brought back here, which is super cool for those paying attention. And there's tons of other stuff like that as well throughout these campaigns. It's one of the best things that the game has going for it outside of its main story. When we do get to Future Imperfect, I do really like how Clint and Kate's banter is different to something like Tony and Commander's. It's still snappy and funny in the same way, but Clint and Kate feel a lot closer through that dialogue, and I really like it. Especially when you get scenes like when Kate just knows when Clint is beating himself up, it really endears you to them early on, which is really good and really important because of the shorter runtime of these extra campaigns. Anyway, I do really like this Clint. Giacomo Gignatti, sorry for mispronouncing that, plays it in a way very different from his MCU counterpart, and I really like it. He feels a lot more comfortable in the situations that he finds himself in, and I think it's a strong suit of his character. I also absolutely love the Old Man Hawkeye exploits destroyed Future Earth opening. And when the crew goes to the future, I love everything with Hawkeye and Kate. But this dialogue problem seriously rears its head again. You're allowed to bring whatever hero you want into these missions. So when you fight this future Hulk that claims the Avengers as fools, Bruce and Tony should really say something about it. even if it's just a throwaway line. Seeing the crashed Chimera and the state of the world should really affect Kamala. This stuff, these smaller character moments, were the only thing that kept the Reassembled campaign from falling apart, and you really feel its absence here. I would genuinely be fine if a campaign revolving around just Clint and Kate, but I was used to one thing before and had it torn away. But not even really torn away, since I can still use the characters, they just don't really exist in the story. It feels really awkward and uncomfortable. I really don't know why the game didn't limit you to just Clint and Kate, since it was fine with doing that in the Reassembled campaign as earlier missions. I assume it was for multiplayer reasons, but I really don't think it was worth it. If you're going to do an Avengers live service game, neutering one of the main reasons the Avengers and by proxy Marvel are the giants that they are now, it just isn't going to do you any good. The dialogue and interactions between these characters is what we love about this franchise for the most part. It's why Marvel Ultimate Alliance years ago spent so much effort putting in unique dialogue. And I'm not even asking for that extent. But when Tony sees about everything that he did and is doing, Bruce still considers them fools and the Avengers are still gone in his future, it should rattle him. When Bruce sees what he could become, it should scare him. And when Kamala sees what becomes of the world, it should make her become so stubbornly determined to stop it from happening that she forces everyone to stop seeing the doom and gloom. And it should inspire Cap to keep fighting even harder. I get why this didn't happen, a mix of COVID and budgets, but honestly, if that was the case, it should either have been delayed or not made at all. This game barely delivered on an Avengers live service game at the start, and falters here even further. My favourite dynamic of Bruce and Kamala, the entire reason I enjoyed Reassembled and found it so almost amazing, is just completely absent here, and it's a real shame. Now, I still like these campaigns. I'm happy with it for the eye patch dog and clearly Kate's dynamic, the future stuff being an enjoyable cherry on top. But god, you feel the absence of Cap's leadership you spent a whole game building up to, and you miss Tony and Kamala's quipping, all of it. It's just a real shame. Going into combat, I just like to get out of the way that for both Taking Aim and Future Imperfect, almost every single combat scenario with no notable exceptions is just enemy syncs. Every encounter has high-level synthroids and at least one adaptoid or dreadbot, normally multiple of both. And towards the end you really feel it. There's no further progression, no new enemy types, just sync after sync, every mission. The only thing that's unique and interesting are the boss fights, but not even all of them are, like Dr. Getz, who is just a beefed up dreadbot. But going back into positives, I do think that Kate is really fun to play. Unlike Iron Man and Nat, where you slowly unlock the aspects to make them more complicated characters, you start at the deep end with Kate, which makes her hard to get the hang of. But by the time you do, she's an absolute blast. Her 3 arrow types are really fun to use in the appropriate situation, and the timing aspect to best use them is really engaging. It all adds up to make Kate a really hard to master character in the best way possible. Her support ability that creates a decoy is complete crap though. It only takes the aggro of a few enemies, and because combat has so many threats with it, you'll still be dealing with a swarm of enemies, so it's just nowhere near as good as other support heroics. However, Kate's offensive ability, the War Power, is probably my favourite in the game, just for how useful it is in both movement and combat. You teleport wherever the arrow lands, so if you got to travel far in exploration sections, you can go further than any flyer can in the same period of time. It's probably the fastest form of traversal of the entire game, and it's a brilliant in-combat closer. I wish it did a bit more damage, but it's still bloody brilliant. But unfortunately, Kate's ultimate is just a bit it just gives a damage boost and speeds up her range attacks. Which, while still being cool, it doesn't compare to the ultimates that clear rooms or change the hero's moveset entirely. But Kate is still one of my favourite heroes in the game for her complexity. That, on top of her fun teleporting movement and the intrinsic meter the rewards just absolutely go to town on your enemies. She's a character you have to really engage with to use to her fullest, but when you do, it's so the most fun you can have in the entire game. Now, skipping most of Taking Aim, because honestly it's nothing new from a gameplay perspective other than the Super Adaptoid, which is a fun fight, but it just doesn't have enough health to last very long, so I can't comment on its moveset or anything. And then moving on to Future Imperfect, we're introduced to Clint Barton, who I also love, but for the same reasons as Kate. If you're familiar with Smash Bros, you'll probably be familiar with the term Echo Fighters, new characters that use previous existing characters as a base. Clint is an Echo hero of Kate, and therefore has pretty much all the same pros and cons in normal gameplay. Movement is a different flavour but mechanically identical, and even though Clint has a different set of arrow types, they're mostly just as situational as Kate's. They're just designed for different situations, and I would like to admit that Clint's arrows feel designed for situations or being more often. I definitely got more use out of Clint's varied arrow set than Kate. The pulsar arrow in particular is a blast to use on bosses and tougher enemies. The more you shoot in a single spot or on a single target and then wait a few moments, the more shockwaves and the more damaging the shockwaves are that go off. It's one of the most satisfying ways to deal damage in the entire game. And as far as normal combat goes, Clint and Kate are identical. But instead of getting an intrinsic boost from its intrinsic meter, Clint gets a straight up damage boost. The abilities is where we see Clint and Kate's biggest differences and what will probably be what makes you decide between these two as to your favourite. For Clint's support ability, we have a recovery arrow which just heals Clint and leaves a little recovery effect in the area around him for anyone to use. The offensive ability is this nice simple arrow storm in front of you, but the ultimate is brilliant. Clint fires this arrow that hits a pretty solid damage on any enemy near you, but stays around and will continue to hit any enemy you continue to target, so it's just always hitting wherever you're fighting. It's super useful. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, that's about where the peaks of future Imperfect lie. Despite the new scenery and locations, we get no new enemy types and not even any interesting new variants. Although I would like to give credit that the build-up to Maestro in the last mission is great. The fact that you're fighting all these mercenaries that are there to guard and stop Maestro from escaping, it builds a lot of suspense for it's definitely the best boss fight in the game so far. Other than that, Future Imperfect doesn't do anything more, so there's no point still talking about it. Now we get to the last campaign for Marvel's Avengers, War for Wakanda, an unintentional and accidental finale for the game. Starting off with the story again, I really like this campaign's opening. It completely removes itself from the current events of the story. T'Challa is to do his own shit his own way, and it feels like a breath of fresh air, and the writers and devs deserve credit for that. And when the Avengers do show up, there's no preamble, the story is going right away. Claw and Abel a problem, how can the Avengers help? I really enjoyed going around the Royal Palace and hearing what people had to say. Clint and Commander in particular had this lovely bit of dialogue, which is wild because it reminded me this is the second time they've ever spoken to each other. Speaking of, the dialogue issue is much less of a problem in this campaign. I assume they were given a bigger budget for this one as expected to draw a lot of older players back to the game, and they definitely used that budget really well. 1. These conversations are exactly what was missing from the previous campaigns. Little moments like T'Challa and Commander both agree that they want to help everyone, 4 being a tourist, Kate being nervous around T'Challa because he's royalty, or 4 talking about how a previous Black Panther had wielded Mjolnir. It all makes the game feel alive in exactly the way you want an Avengers game to. And it makes the game so much more enjoyable. I still wish there was more of it, but this is back to the same quality as Reassembled. Which, while it could be better, it's still better than what we had. 2. Wakanda looks phenomenal. The environments are gorgeous and easily the best in the game. The Destroyed Future did what it was trying to do well, but Wakanda absolutely stands up to and rivals the MCU. I absolutely adore it. And 3, this extra budget means we get Claw and Crossbones as our antagonists. Steve Blum kills it as Claw. I was actually originally pretty put off by the voice because it just sounds like Spike from Bebop but a lot sleazier. But as the story progressed and he got more scenes in a short amount of time, he really grew on me. And Crossbones has 2 short but sweet appearances at the start and end, which is really cool. He probably would have appeared more down the line if the game was still getting content, but even though he doesn't appear much here, I preferred him a lot to Taskmaster showing up for 10 seconds in Future Imperfect. And overall, I really enjoyed War for Wakanda's story. The way that it focuses on T'Challa as a flawed king, but it also includes the Avengers enough that they don't steal the spotlight, but also never feel left out. The way it got me to care at least a bit about Wakanda and its people worked way better when it tried to save everything for S.H.I.E.L.D. It's all really great. And while I do think all of these elements could have been improved at least a bit further, I definitely think a few more cutscenes or missions pushing T'Challa further would have been absolutely perfect. And maybe 1 or 2 more missions helping Wakanda's people would have gone even further. But that finale, even despite all the flaws I mentioned, the finale is what makes this the best part of the game. Not the best part of this campaign, the whole game. The Claw Crossbones Trin boss fight that is the culmination of all the story of this campaign. Sure, we trusted T'Challa is great, it doesn't have as much emotional weight as it could, but it rings just as powerful as the end of Reassembled while still having you in full control and being fucking awesome. And also, we get pure sound Claw. That's fucking awesome. I love Claw. I think he's a great character that doesn't get used enough and stuff. Although that does remind me of something I really want to commend this game for. Like the MCU, this game is trying to keep these heroes as grounded as it reasonably can. That's why the art and character design leans towards this more grounded style. You see more the tech in Tony's suit. Cap is wearing body armor because even though he's a super soldier, he's not bulletproof. But unlike the MCU, the game never does this at the cost of its bigger ideas. We still get this insane and brilliant looking MODOK, and we still get pure sound Claw. And I really respect the game for that. I just wanted to commend them here because I've never seen that praised anywhere else. So yeah, War for Wakanda is the best campaign in Marvel's Avengers easily. It feels pretty unfair compared it to the 2 that came before. It's seriously top shelf stuff, but it's a shame that it also marked the end. Now onto the combat, which starts off phenomenally. To start, we get new enemy types in the form of Claw's goons who introduce the overcharge trait, which is a fun twist on some enemies. But what's even better is the vibranium shield that some Claw enemies have. It makes it so you need to think and strategize when fighting these enemies, as it means that you can't use your conventional and easiest methods to dispatch them efficiently, and I love that mechanic tons. The Claw enemies had some fun additional challenge in their new movesets, and thanks to them, Wakanda feels much more unique and stands out even more than it already did. We also get the spider enemies, which are less interesting, but their different movesets and unique style makes them a fun addition all the same. As far as our new hero is concerned, Black Panther is great. As far as traversal goes, he plays just like Cap, but combat is where he really stands out as an incredibly fun up-close brawler. He has one range attack, but it doesn't have great damage, and considering the Chun has some really great distance closers, I never found much use for it. It can be good for finishing off low health opponents if you don't want to get close though, especially if it's stacking properties where the more you use it, the more damage each hit does. But if you want to get in close, one of those distance closers is his pounce attack, which if used correctly can take an enemy out of the fight in a few moments. His other heavy and normal attacks flow brilliantly together and are satisfying to use, and his intrinsic meter that absorbs damage when you properly counter and can then be used to deal tons of damage back is a brilliant adaptation to suit from the films and feels great to use. Moving on to the supers, his support ability is 3 Kimoyo beads that attack enemies as slightly buff allies. It's one of the easiest to effectively use in the game, although the damage it deals makes it pretty situational. The offensive ability is fucking brilliant though. T'Challa pulls out this huge spear that does tons of damage, and it's amazing in boss fights and against high level goons, one of my absolute favourites. And his ultimate creates this area of effect of damage, and then this panther attack damages anything it touches. Which is a lot to wrap your head around, and it makes the move pretty hard to learn, but once you've figured it out, it's pretty fun. Going back to the unique gameplay in the campaign itself, the first Crossbones fight is really fun. Especially with the unique pounce interaction that's called, and the swapping from attacking him to attacking the sonic gun that makes the fight really engaging. The introduction to the claw enemies is really good, and there's also this nice little puzzle segment that also doubles as a lore dump onto the history of Wakanda. It's really solid. And skipping a little later to the Surfer Belt Protection mission, it's super fun doing this wave defense, the turret and the EMP, it's all great and a highlight in the game that does a great job showcasing how solid the game's enemy design is when it's not the only pillar of what you're doing. This is what I was on about ages ago when I said we'd get to my favourite encounter later. And going into the exploration part of this video a little bit early just for a second, I think that Wakanda is the absolute peak of the game's exploration sections. Playing with flying characters, you won't notice a difference to anywhere else in the game, but when playing characters that are on foot, especially Cap and T'Challa with their double jumps, you notice and feel how well designed Wakanda's environments are to be rewarding to traverse without being too boring or challenging. Now, I'm not saying it's bloody Mirror's Edge or Dying Light or fucking Breath of the Wild or anything like that, but I still really enjoy it and want to praise it. As far as the rest of War for Wakanda's content is concerned, there's not much that's notable, but I would like to say that even if the rest of the campaign isn't groundbreaking or anything, environments are always great and never overstay their welcome. And the gameplay throughout this entire campaign is better than any of the previous ones. It's great and it makes the 2 to 3 hours the campaign takes fly by. But before we move on, I need to talk about that final fight, because this is the best boss fight in the entire game. The Claw Crossbones team up is brilliant. If I had to nitpick, I'd say the second phase with just Claw could be a bit of a pushover, but it's an absolute blast and the first phase is always challenging even with a post-game build. Claw in the first phase could trap a specific character into a 1v1 brawl and it always ends up with me either at low health or just knocked out. It's always a tough fight, but god is it great, easily the peak of the game's boss design. And that is War for Wakanda. Now, while I said that War for Wakanda was the end, it only is as far as the big stuff is concerned. There's still some small stuff you can do. There's a small side mission with Thor that implied Loki was going to be involved in the story, and was probably going to make some kind of appearance down the line if the game wasn't dropped. The Winter Soldier has a kind of story, and it was clearly done with a fraction of the time and money as anything else. The cutscenes are nowhere near the same caliber, I mean they don't even have working subtitles. But I would admit I like Bucky and Cap's chemistry if absolutely nothing else. It really does just fall flat overall though. Which is a real shame because there was tons of potential here. What you're actually left with in the end is tiny cutscene, go on a mission that has no relation, go watch another tiny cutscene, rinse and repeat. It's even more of a shame because I kind of love this game's Bucky. He's really insecure about his place on the team, and a lot of his dialogue on the helipad and the elevators is him being surprised at the faith and confidence his friends and allies put in him. I really wish we got more of it. It's really interesting and it made him probably my second or third favourite character. Like there's a moment you can find where T'Challa talks about having Shuri look at his arm, Cap and Nat are always reaffirmed that they're there for him. Bruce recommends him a therapist, it's all great, so imagine if that was explored in actually good content. There's also the Mighty Thor, which starts with the coolest concept for a campaign ever and then just completely drops it, which is a real shame. Like, imagine traveling to this destroyed dystopian Asgard and fighting this corrupted Allfather, having to fight alongside Loki, it's brilliant. Unfortunately, I guess it was too cool even for this game, because you just never do it. That's just her backstory that you get in an admittedly alright cutscene. Her gameplay and story are exactly the same as Bucky. Do a mission, small cutscene, rinse and repeat. There are a few other interesting things in some of the existing missions, but it's not that much. I like the Maestro rematches for the dialogue between him and Clint. Honestly, Maestro in general is just one of the best parts of this post-game, even though he barely exists in it, which kind of shows the quality. Nothing in the gameplay is really assisting the storytelling in any way. It's just 3 enemy syncs and a rematch with either Maestro or this version of Taskmaster in the future. I hate future Taskmaster so much. I skipped it. I'm not going into it. There's also a mission that involves MODOK's potential resurrection. It's a shame that it never went anywhere, but the mission itself is quite alright, even though it does conclude with both MODOK and Monica on this cliffhanger that we'll never see the resolution of. There's also some cool stuff in the game's raids, especially the claw one, but I'm not going to be commenting on them here. When I was recording this video, it was really difficult to get a raid organised and going. I was only able to do it thanks to the Marvel's Avengers Discord that I'll link in the description, since it is a super cool community. You need 4 players at 150 power for 2 of the raids, and 4 at 185 power for the biggest raid. And unfortunately, this is not something that's really feasible to expect. You won't even be close to 100 power by the time you beat all the campaigns, and the game caps out at 145 in single player, so you need to already be doing raids or a very specific grindy event to even get to the gear that you need. So we'll be doing the 150 raids for ages, even though there's only 2 of them, and it takes forever to get to the level to do the 185 raid. It's just not feasible in any way, and I think it's a shit system, and I'll be talking good about them later, but in terms of this, it's just shit. By the time you're watching this, you probably won't even be able to participate in these in any way. And there's no way in the few months before the game is taken off of storefronts that they're going to release a single player version that would rework the AI. It's just not feasible. What you can actually do in this post game, this again has some cool elements. There are conclusions to a lot of hanging plot threads that result in these missions, like Monica and the Cosmic Cube, which I would admit is really cool and a personal highlight of the entire game for me. It's a really great boss fight, and again, setting up for more future stuff that we'll unfortunately never see. But unfortunately, that's about it. If you wanted any other kind of new story content, even though there isn't even much in the raids, there is some there, but if you're buying the game for the story, it's not worth it to do the post game. But as we've gone through, the rest of the campaigns certainly are. Now, most of the post-game's gameplay is just repeating stuff you've already done. The same vaults, the same objectives, the same locations, which is where I get to talk about those locations. I brought this up in the War for Wakanda section, and everything I said then still holds true, although the fun does wear off after the 50th mission in the same smaller environments that Wakanda has. All of the other environments though are these huge open places designed to be used multiple times, multiple ways, and some of them are seriously huge. Although, due to the way the game is structured, you'll never see more than a quarter of any given map in any given mission. They're fun to explore, especially with flying characters, and discovering secrets does take a fair few hours to wear thin. As far as fully unique content goes, there isn't a ton. You fight more of the same warbots you fought in the Reassembled campaign. Well, I didn't mention them there because I've already repeated myself a lot in this video, so I was going to save them until now. And now we're here, they are a really fun encounter. The fact that you can scale them to help destroy them is always great and works really well even in multiplayer, which is pretty cool. But it's really worn thin after the 20th time fighting each of these. I can point to all my eyes closed at this point, same goes for the fuse drills. You do get a unique boss fight of Abomination and Taskmaster, and then if you're a bit stronger, a future Taskmaster and Maestro. Unfortunately, all 4 of these are bullet sponges and your mileage will vary based on whatever moveset bores you the least. Taskmaster has some cool stuff he can do, and Maestro is my personal favourite, but that's only because of how much damage he can do, which makes him a genuine enough threat for most of the post game, but that's fun enough. All of them are super easy to kill, they're using a mechanic that I haven't talked about yet, battery. Now, since I've been using Iron Man a lot, you're probably a bit curious as to where my laser and repulsor colours have been changing throughout the video. That's because I changed the element that the repulsors and lasers fire. Now, like most live service games, Avengers has a gear system, and while most of it is bullshit stats that you can't really feel when you play, which is always a huge gripe that I have with these games, the actual named and listed specific buffs that you can get are really cool. Maybe you'll get resistance to a certain damage type, or the ability to use your support heroic multiple times, but the best ones are the ones that make specific attacks deal specific damage types. Iron Man is the easiest to show this with because of how divided his melee and range attacks are. Here, I equipped an item to make some of my range attacks do sonic damage, and when I'm up close and personal, I'm doing shock damage. And there's tons of these: cryo, gamma, plasma, pim, vibranium, etc, etc. After dealing enough of a specific damage type to a given enemy, they'll glow that damage type, and sometimes there'll be an additional small effect, like the pim damage type that shrinks enemies, or cryo that slows enemies slightly. But the best part is that some damage types are categorized as positive, and some are labeled as negative. When you max out an enemy with your positive or negative damage type and then hit them with the opposite, you do huge damage. Everywhere I went in the community, I heard it being called battery damage, and it's where you get the clearest distinction from where you started and where you ended playing this game. It's a brilliant mechanic in an otherwise really middle of the road, completely basic gear system. Moving on to why I use this battery system the most, the Monica Cosmic Cube boss fight. There are other new boss fights, but there's a lot behind the game's raid feature, which as I've said you probably won't be able to do by the time you watch this video, so I'm mostly skipping it here. But the raids are fun as hell if you ever do get a chance, and while I know I haven't mentioned this game's multiplayer much, that's been because the game doesn't use it the best. It's more of just having more competent AI teammates on your side and feel like actual players. I will give the raids praise here for making you feel like a genuine team, based on the characters you choose who have different strengths and weaknesses. And since every team will probably have a flyer, if you're that flyer, you'll be called on for some pretty important roles. And if you don't have a flyer, you and your team have to be doing things the hard way. It's really great. It's hard to explain without actually diving into the raids, which other videos on the site do better since I was given a very limited exposure to them. But for what you can play without big restrictions, there are the two Monaco boss fights. The first is a double mech suit fight, which is fun but just alright since it is just two mechs that you fought a million of, but with really big health bars. And the second is the Cosmic Cube fight, which is always brilliant. You have to destroy some powerful clones and they did a ton of damage to Monaco while her shield is down, or else you'll be dealt so much damage you basically die immediately. It takes out the Hulkbuster from full health in one go. It's insane. It's a fight that's always stressful but also always fun, and it's one of the best fights in the entire game. Now moving on to our final talking point, the two additional characters. The Mighty Thor, who I'll call Jane Foster for now because it's easier, and the Winter Soldier, who I've already been calling Bucky. Starting with Jane, she's the closest character in the entire game to a straight up copy. Aside from some little nitpicks and some really cool unique animation, she plays extremely similarly to Thor. The attacks feel the same, the intrinsic meter functions almost the same, and the support and offensive abilities are identical. The biggest difference aside from the animations is Jane's ultimate, which gives Jane a big damage boost and a slightly different moveset as the Bifrost AoE that Thor had, which is less unique, but I see this being a deciding reason that makes most of the community prefer her. Moving swiftly onto Bucky, he's much more of his own character. While his movement is very similar to Black Widow, it doesn't stand out as much because his combat is much more of a perfect middle ground between range and melee. His intrinsic meter requires you to do counters, and when you do enough you get a nice damage and defense boost, which really helps keep you in the fray with Bucky and is really fun with the rest of his moveset. Like Tony and Nat, he gets free ranged firing types as you level up and unlock them. Although I never found any use for anything other than burst fire, and I'm sure there are situations the other two types could be useful in, that's just my personal preference. His different firing types and upgrades through the range skill tree make it possible to stand back and fight from a distance, or you level up the melee skill tree and be super involved and close up using some brilliant melee combos. He's probably the most flexible character in the game for all that you can do with him, which is furthered even more by his abilities, which never require much setup and can be used on the go. His support ability makes him invisible for a time, but more importantly creates a blast of damage that you can upgrade to be pretty dangerous. His assault ability is this airstrike in front of him that I love and get tons of use out of, and what his ultimate is just another example of the slight damage buff and a slight moveset change. Thanks to his hyper offensive playstyle, I think it actually works really well here. And that's pretty much it, so with every single character we discussed, let's rank them, because why the hell not, it's my video and you watch this far anyway. Top is Iron Man with Bucky close behind in second, both are really versatile but offensive characters that appeal to my sensibilities really well. Iron Man does barely squeak out because of my love of the character and my slight preference for his super abilities, but also the fact that he has much better costumes. Then in third is Cap. The abilities you get while leveling him up make him a huge master play by the end of his skill tree, and his counter is always satisfying to use. Right behind is T'Challa, who is a character you can always get stuck into combat with, and his intrinsic meter helps to reward quick thinking without distracting you from the fight. In fifth is Clint Barton Hawkeye, who thanks to how fun his pulsar arrows are, is sometimes my favourite in the game depending on what I'm in the mood for. Then in sixth is Kate Bishop Hawkeye for similar reasons. And then there's Black Widow, who I only really dislike because everything I love about her, Bucky does better. And then there's the Thors, who are in the same spot because they're basically the same. I do love them, but just don't have that much reason to play them when Iron Man is right there. And Hulk and Commander share the bottom spot because they just don't engage me very much. And that's it. On to our conclusion. So in complete honesty, I don't know why I left so much of that post-game section in. Because while I tried really hard to get this video out beforehand, you can no longer buy Marvel's Avengers. You can still absolutely pirate the game to experience that single player, and the multiplayer will still exist and work. But it's been delisted and removed from all online storefronts, and it's now harder than ever to play this game. And that really pisses me off, not because I love this game or anything. Despite this video's length and a lot of things that I've said, this video is only so positive leaning because I never see the positive this game talked about. I left out a whole section about bugs and performance issues, arbitrary restrictions, some graphical hiccups, a strong dislike for the misuse of Taskmaster in both the main campaign and future Imperfect, and the old monetization system because it's all been talked about before. I don't love this game 100% of the time when I'm playing it, but I like it most of the time, and sometimes I absolutely love it, and I at least think it's worth the price of admission, especially with how low the online store price got towards the end of the game's life. But at the very least, it certainly doesn't deserve to be wiped from all digital storefronts forever and for a whole pretty great experience to be removed like it never existed. There was time and effort and love put into this game, and it shows. You don't get some of these really great cutscenes of a soulless cash grab. You don't get moments like these where actors and writers that care about these characters in the story. Marvel's Avengers is not the Avengers game reward or really deserved. It had a horrendous, unforgivable launch, but I seriously feel like with a bit more care and a bit more effort, it could have recovered. War for Wakanda is genuinely just great, flat out, and with how the game is structured, you can literally skip everything else and only play that. I wouldn't recommend it, but I mean, you can. And some of the people I've met in the community playing this game are genuinely amazing and made the online experience an absolute blast. And if you're one of those people watching this, thank you. Your passion for this game made this video as positive as it is. And discussions that I had with some of you made me see some things I saw as flaws as positives, and I'll definitely be playing this game more just to continue to be a part of a pretty solid community. Overall, it's a tragedy, and I hate to see it made by so many talented people be disregarded like it was nothing, and for all of their work to be erased. For the reason of art preservation alone, it should stay up. Sweep up to the rug if you need to, pretend it happened, shut down the servers, but don't delete it. Don't delete hundreds of people's hundreds of hours of work. And there was also so much potential here for future content. There was a lot of teasing about Captain Marvel, like I mentioned earlier, which would have been a blast to play. There's some cool Ant-Man teasing as well. Playing as Scott or Cassie Lang would have been really fun. And I personally would have loved to see Doctor Strange be tackled by this game's very grounded, but still quite comic booky world. It's just all a shame. Maybe modders could go into it, but War for Wakanda just had so much hope. Like, you could see the possibility of the Avengers having to deal with AIM ripping through the fabric of dimensions and Doctor Strange having to help out, or having to break into AIM's research bases through shrinking as Ant-Man, or maybe deal with Kingpin teaming up with AIM having to deal with them in a Hell's Kitchen focused campaign with Daredevil or Luke Cage, or have a sea-based campaign with AIM polluting the ocean, you have to help Namor, or maybe stop Namor from doing more damage than he needs to because he thinks the Avengers aren't doing enough. Namor would honestly be amazing. He has tons of story potential because of how morally grey he is. There's so much you could go into there, but I'll stop giving out hypotheticals of parts of this game that we're never going to get. If you can, play this game. Buy a second-hand physical copy, pirate it, try to find a not overly inflated Steam key, anything. If you sat through this entire overly long video and it seemed worth your time, I genuinely say that the Avengers game is worth it. It's a good game if nothing else. Not a masterpiece, far from perfect and at times boring. But in this state, it's good. I wouldn't have made this video if it wasn't deserving of your time. Fun combat and at times brilliant, at times just bearable story, but a really cool community and a lot of heart from a lot of people who clearly cared about what they were making. So yeah, I won't waste any more of your time. Thank you.